All right, buckle up, everyone, because today we're diving headfirst into one of the most brutal chapters in medieval history, the Cressy Campaign.
Ah, yes. 1346, the Hundred Years' War is raging, and
Oh, and by the way, a huge thank you to all of you listeners out there for sending in that interview with Dan Jones, author of Essex Dogs.
it's a fantastic read, isn't it? Really flips the script on how we view this conflict.
It does. And that's exactly what we're going to unpack today. Forget those romanticized tales of chivalry and knights. We're getting down the mud and blood with the, what did Jones call them?
The Essex dogs?
Right, the Essex Dogs. These guys were the grunts, the foot soldiers, far from your shining knights in armor.
Absolutely. They were mercenaries, thugs, men driven by survival, not some noble ideal. Really gives you a different perspective on what it was like to fight in the Hundred Years' War.
Speaking of which, let's back up for a sec. This whole Hundred Years' War, it wasn't just a family squabble over who sat on the French throne, right? I mean, it's got to be more complicated than that. Yes.
Way more complicated. Sure, you had Edward III of England claiming the French throne through his mother's lineage. But this war, oh, it was about so much more. Territorial disputes, economic rivalries, it dragged in a huge chunk of Europe.
So power grabs, land, and money, the classics.
You got it. And that brings us right to the Cressy campaign. Imagine a medieval blitzkrieg. Edward III unleashes this brutal tactic called the chevauchée, basically burn and pillage everything in your path.
Oof, talk about scorched earth.
No kidding. And it's a tactic that, sadly, has echoes throughout history right up to modern warfare. But what Jones does brilliantly is he brings it down to the human level through the eyes of those Essex dogs.
So no romanticized knights here, huh?
No. Instead, we meet guys like Romford, a young archer, just trying to survive this meat grinder of a war.
You know, in the interview, you mentioned something about Jones challenging the traditional view of Edward the Black Prince. Most folks think of him as this young hero, but you're saying not so fast.
Well, Jones definitely complicates that picture. He shows the Black Prince involved in some pretty brutal stuff, like the sacking of monasteries. Not exactly chivalrous knight behavior, is it?
Yikes, that's a far cry from the history books.
And there's even a point where the prince is almost captured at the Battle of Cressy, and his own father, Edward III, refuses to send help. Doesn't exactly fit the perfect warrior image.
Definitely makes you rethink those heroic tales, huh?
Speaking of rethinking things, Jones also presents a very different view of sexuality in the 14th century. Not exactly what we'd consider normal today, I imagine.
Exactly. He emphasizes that slapping our modern labels of homosexual and heterosexual onto people back then, it just doesn't work.
So it's not as simple as just checking a box.
Not at all. Jones uses the relationship between Romford and the Black Prince as an example. Their bond, well, it's a complex, shaped by their social dynamics, their shared experiences in war, and, yeah, their attraction to each other.
So we got to look at those relationships through the lens of their time, not ours. Exactly. Trying to force fit those labels just distorts the picture, doesn't it? It's about recognizing that human experience, even back then, it's nuanced and fluid.
It's about recognizing the complexity of the past, that's for sure. And on that note, let's talk about Jones's portrayal of medieval warfare itself. From what I've heard, he doesn't sugarcoat it one bit.
Not even a little. He describes scenes that are just brutal, visceral, terrifying, and incredibly real.
I'm thinking of that scene where Romford gets trapped on the ground during the Battle of Cressy.
Oh, that one is intense. Just imagine being surrounded by thousands of soldiers, the clash of steel, the screams. Romford describes it as a forest of legs and mud-caked boots all around him.
Chilling. Definitely shatters any romantic notions of warfare.
It does. It brings home the fact that this was about survival, pure and simple.
And after the carnage of Cressy, the English set their sights on Calais. Now, I might be wrong, but Calais, it doesn't seem like that big of a deal, does it? Why all the fuss?
Oh, you'd be surprised. Calais, back then, it was a strategic and economic gold mine. Sitting right on the narrowest point of the English Channel, it controlled access to the super wealthy region of Flanders. This war, it wasn't just about land, it was about money and trade, too.
So the siege of Calais, it was as much about economics as conquest.
Totally. Both England and France were hemorrhaging money to fund this war. Edward III needed to secure those sweet, sweet trade routes.
Makes sense. And isn't that where the famous story of the Burghers of Calais comes in?
You got it. Those 6 prominent citizens who basically offered themselves up as hostages to Edward III to save their city, ready to be executed, the whole 9 yards. It's this dramatic, almost mythical story, but
But there's a but.
well, there's this debate, right? Was it a genuine act of self-sacrifice, or was Edward III playing everyone? I mean, he gets to look merciful by sparing them while also tightening his grip on Calais.
A classic power move disguised as mercy. Makes you wonder, doesn't it? How
Mhm.
much of history is just carefully crafted stories?
It does. It's a reminder that history, well, it's rarely black and white. We have these chronicles, accounts written by people with their own agendas.
Like a puzzle with missing pieces, and maybe some pieces from a completely different puzzle mixed in.
Perfect analogy. And speaking of puzzles, let's go back to Edward the Black Prince for a minute. We were discussing how Jones kind of picks apart that whole chivalrous prince image.
Right, and that whole business with the monasteries, that definitely wasn't very knightly.
Exactly. And it wasn't just a one-off thing. Jones paints this picture of a guy who, yeah, he was a skilled military leader, but also capable of some pretty ruthless stuff.
So maybe we shouldn't judge him too harshly by today's standards.
Exactly. Got to remember the context right. And that whole idea of context, it's especially important when we're talking about Jones's portrayal of sexuality in the 14th century. It can be a tough thing for us modern folks to wrap our heads around.
Yeah, totally different world back then.
Exactly. And Jones, he's careful not to slap our 21st century labels on these historical figures. He presents a more nuanced view, recognizing that relationships and social dynamics, well, they work differently back then.
Like we talked about earlier, forcing our modern categories onto the past, it just muddies the waters.
It does. What Jones shows us is that by exploring these relationships through the lens of the 14th century, we actually gain a deeper, more authentic understanding.
And it's not just about focusing on the big names, the kings and princes.
Mm-hmm.
Jones really highlights the importance of seeing history through the eyes of everyday folks.
Absolutely. Those Essex dogs, they weren't fighting for glory or some political cause. They were fighting to survive. And their stories, well, they show us the real cost of war, the hardship, the trauma, the ever-present threat of death.
It's a good reminder that history isn't just about dates and battles. It's about people's lives, their experiences.
Exactly. And it's through those individual stories, those moments of fear, courage, resilience, that we truly connect with the past.
So, as we wrap up this part of our deep dive into the Cressy campaign, I want to shift gears a bit and touch on something we haven't really talked about yet. The role of economics in all of this.
Ah, yes. It's easy to get caught up in the battles and the politics, but the financial side of things, well, that played a huge role.
I mean, wars are expensive, right?
Oh, incredibly. Both England and France were practically bankrupting themselves to fund these armies.
Edward III actually went bankrupt, didn't he?
He did, multiple times, even wiped out some big banking families who'd loaned him money. And that financial pressure, it had a direct impact on his military decisions.
Wow. So the outcome of battles, maybe even the entire war, could come down to something as simple as money.
Simple, but essential. Money, economics, it's always been a driving force in history, and war is no exception. The need for resources, control of trade routes, all of it fuels conflict.
Like they say, follow the money and you'll find the truth. Looking at the Hundred Years' War through that lens, it really gives you a new perspective.
It does. It highlights how everything is connected. Politics, warfare, economics, they all feed into each other.
And that's what makes these deep dives so fascinating, right? We get to see those connections, the bigger picture. It's not just about memorizing dates and names.
Absolutely. So as we move towards wrapping up this part of our conversation, what are your thoughts so far? What stood out to you about the Cressy campaign?
You know, it's funny, we often think about history as these big sweeping narrative, but what really grabs me are the personal stories, like the ones Jones tells in Essex Dogs. It's easy to forget that behind the battles and the politics, there were real people with hopes and fears just like ours.
That's so true. And I think that's what makes Jones's work so powerful. He brings those individuals to life. It's not just about understanding what happened, but about feeling how those events impacted the lives of those who lived through them.
Exactly. And speaking of impact, let's shift our focus to the legacy of the Cressy campaign. It was a major victory for the English, but how did it actually shape the course of the Hundred Years' War? What were the long-term consequences for both England and France?
Well, strategically speaking, Cressy really shook the French. It showed them just how effective English tactics and weapons were, especially that longbow. Plus, it opened the door for the capture of Calais, which, as we discussed, was a huge strategic win.
Right, having Calais gave the English a foothold on the continent, a base for future campaigns, basically changed the whole game.
It did, but it also fueled a lot of resentment and animosity between the two nations, kind of added fuel to the fire, which, kept burning for decades. Remember, the Hundred Years' War wasn't one single conflict. It was a series of campaigns, truces, power struggles, the whole shebang. Cressy was a turning point, sure, but it wasn't the end of the story.
It's a reminder that history rarely goes according to plan. It's messy, unpredictable, and often has unintended consequences.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And I think that's one of the key takeaways from studying history, wouldn't you say? It encourages us to think critically, to question what we think we know, and to recognize that even events that seem far removed from our lives can have ripple effects that last for centuries.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I want to circle back to something about Jones's writing that really struck me, something we touched on earlier. His ability to blend historical accuracy with storytelling. He really brings the past to life, doesn't he? It's both informative and incredibly engaging.
He's a master of that, no doubt. He doesn't just throw facts and dates at you. He drops you right into the world he's describing. You can almost see the sights, hear the sounds, even smell the smells of the 14th century.
It's like he's opening a window to the past, allowing us not just to understand, but to actually experience history. And for me, that's the mark of a truly great historical writer.
Couldn't agree more. And that's what makes these deep dives so rewarding, isn't it? It's not just about absorbing information, but about engaging with the past on a deeper level.
So, as we conclude our exploration of the Cressy campaign, I want to leave you, our listeners, with a final thought. We've covered the military tactics, the political maneuvering, the economic factors, the human stories, all the pieces of this pivotal event. But what I find most fascinating is how Jones challenges us to rethink how we view history itself.
How so?
By shifting our focus away from the great man narrative and toward the experiences of everyday people. It's a reminder that history isn't just about kings and queens and battles. It's about the collective experience of humanity. All those individual stories, when you weave them together, they create the tapestry of the past.
That's a powerful way to look at it. It challenges us to approach history with a sense of humility and curiosity, always looking to understand the diverse perspectives and experiences that have shaped the world we live in today.
Exactly. And I hope this deep dive has inspired you to explore this fascinating period of history even further, to uncover those hidden stories and to keep questioning, keep learning, and keep discovering.
And if you're looking for a great place to start, I highly recommend checking out Dan Jones's Essex Dogs and its sequel, Wolves of Winter. They're more than just great war stories. They're portals into a complex and often misunderstood era, brought to life by a truly gifted writer.
Couldn't agree more. So until our next deep dive, keep those curiosity gears turning, everyone. And remember, the past is always with us if you know where to look.
It really is a fascinating story, those burgers. They really embody that whole idea of history being, more than just a simple story. On the one hand, it's this incredible act of self-sacrifice. These men, they were leaders in their community, willing to die to save their city. But then you have historians arguing that Edward III, he might have been the one pulling the strings the whole time.
So it's like he gets to look like a merciful king by sparing them, but at the same time, he's solidifying his control over Calais.
Exactly. It's a classic power move, dressed up as an act of mercy. Makes you think twice about taking things at face value, doesn't it? How much of what we believe about history is actually true and how much is, well, spin.
Right. It's a good reminder that history is rarely black and white. It's more like shades of gray. We have these chronicles, these accounts written by people with their own biases and agendas.
It's true. It's like, imagine trying to put together a puzzle, but some of the pieces are missing, and then you realize some of them might be from a completely different puzzle altogether.
And that's what makes it so intriguing. We're constantly sifting through the evidence, trying to figure out what's real, what's been embellished, and ultimately trying to make sense of it all.
Absolutely. And speaking of figuring things out, let's go back to Edward the Black Prince for a second. We were talking about how Jones, in his book, he kind of chips away at that traditional chivalrous image of the prince.
Yeah, he wasn't always the noble warrior that history makes him out to be, was he?
Not always, no. Like,
Right.
we talked about his involvement in the sacking of those monasteries. Pretty brutal stuff, not exactly what you'd expect from a knight all about chivalry and honor.
Definitely not.
And it's not just isolated incidents either. Jones presents a broader picture of the Black Prince, A man who, while definitely a skilled military commander, was also capable of great, well, brutality. We have to remember the times, though, right? It was a brutal age, and he was a product of that environment.
Right. It's like you said earlier, we can't judge historical figures solely through the lens of our modern values. We have to consider the context of their time.
Exactly. And that idea of understanding the context, it's crucial, especially when we're talking about Jones's portrayal of sexuality in the 14th century. It's a topic that, it can be challenging for modern readers to fully grasp.
It's definitely a different world back then, that's for sure. Our ideas about sexual identity and orientation, well, they just didn't exist in the same way.
Exactly. And Jones, he steers clear of trying to impose those 21st century labels on these historical figures. Instead, he offers a more nuanced perspective, recognizing that relationships and social dynamics back then, they operated under a different set of rules, so to speak.
Like we were saying before, trying to force our modern categories onto the past is like trying to fit a square peg into a round hole. It just doesn't work.
It doesn't. And what Jones demonstrates is that by examining these relationships within the specific social and cultural context of the 14th century, we can actually gain a much richer and more accurate understanding.
It's not just about the big names either, the kings, the princes, the generals. Jones also reminds us how important it is to view history through the eyes of everyday people, the folks whose lives often get overlooked in those grand narratives.
Absolutely. Think about those Essex dogs again. They weren't fighting for glory, for a crown, for some political cause. They were fighting simply to stay alive. Through their stories, we get a glimpse of the true cost of war, the physical hardships, the mental and emotional trauma, the constant fear of death. It's a stark reminder that history, it's not just dates and battles, it's about people's lives. Real people whose lives were forever altered by those events.
Exactly. And their experiences, their stories, they help us connect with the past on a much deeper level, don't they?
They do. They remind us that history isn't just some abstract concept in a textbook. It's about real people who lived, loved, struggled, and ultimately left their mark on the world, no matter how small. And that's something worth remembering, isn't it?
It is. It really is. So, as we move towards the final part of our deep dive into the Cressy campaign, I want to shift gears a bit and talk about something we haven't touched on yet. The role of economics in the 100 Years' War. It's easy to get caught up in the military aspects, the battles, the strategies, but the financial side of things, well, it played a huge role in shaping the conflict, wouldn't you say?
Oh, absolutely. Wars, they're incredibly expensive endeavors. And both England and France, they were struggling to keep up with the costs of maintaining their armies and funding these campaigns.
And Edward III, he was particularly known for having some financial issues, wasn't he?
He was. He actually went bankrupt several times, believe it or not. Even managed to wipe out some prominent banking families who had loaned him money. And that financial pressure, well, it definitely influenced his decisions, even his military strategy.
Wow. It's amazing to think that the outcome of battles, maybe even the entire war, could be influenced by something as, well, mundane as money.
It might seem mundane to us, but in reality, economics has always been a major factor in shaping human history, and warfare is no exception. Think about it. The competition for resources, control of trade routes, access to lucrative markets, these are all economic factors that have fueled conflicts for centuries.
It's like that old saying, follow the money and you'll find the truth. When we look at the 100 Years' War through that lens, through the lens of economics, it really adds another layer of understanding, doesn't it?
It does. It highlights how everything's connected. Politics, warfare, economics, they all influence each other in complex and fascinating ways.
And that's what I love about these deep dives. We get to explore those connections, see the bigger picture, and appreciate just how multifaceted and intricate history truly is. It's not just about memorizing dates and names. It's about understanding the forces that shape our world, even those that might seem distant or irrelevant at first glance.
Couldn't have said it better myself. And as we move towards wrapping up this part of our discussion, I'm curious to hear your thoughts. What's resonated with you so far about the Cressy campaign? What's sticking with you from our conversation?
Well, for me, it's that idea that Jones puts forth, shifting the focus away from the great man narrative to the experiences of, well, regular people, the Essex dogs. It's powerful stuff.
Yeah.
It makes you realize that history, it's not just about kings and queens and generals. It's about the collective experience of humanity.
Absolutely. It's those individual stories, those moments of fear, courage, love, loss. Those are the threads that, when woven together, create the tapestry of history. And that brings us to, I guess, the lasting impact of the Cressy campaign. It was this huge victory for the English, no doubt. But how did it actually change the course of the Hundred Years' War? What were the long-term ripple effects for both England and France? Well, militarily speaking, Cressy was a real blow to the French. I mean, it showed them just how effective the English were, especially with that longbow. And of course, it led to the capture of Calais, which, as we talked about, was a major strategic prize for the English.
Right. Having Calais gave them that foothold on the continent, a base to launch more attacks, really turned the tide, so to speak.
It did, but it also, poured gasoline on that fire of resentment and animosity between the two countries, kept that cycle of violence going for, well, decades. Remember, the Hundred Years' War wasn't just one big battle. It was this long, drawn-out series of campaigns, truces, betrayals, power struggles, the whole works. Cressy was a turning point for sure, but it definitely wasn't the end of the story.
Right. History, it's messy. It rarely goes according to plan, full of surprises and unintended consequences.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the biggest lessons we can take away from studying the past. It teaches us to think critically, to challenge our assumptions, to understand that even events that seem, ancient history can have a lasting impact on the world.
Speaking of lasting impact, I want to go back to something we talked about earlier, something that really struck me about Dan Jones's writing. It's his ability to, to make history come alive. He blends those historical facts with such compelling storytelling.
He's amazing at that, isn't he?
Yeah.
He doesn't just give you the dry facts and dates. He pulls you into the story. You can almost smell the mud and blood, hear the clash of swords, feel the fear and the excitement of battle.
It's like stepping through a time portal right into the heart of the 14th century. And that, to me, is what sets apart a good history book from a truly great one.
Absolutely. And that's why I think these deep dives are so valuable. It's not just about learning new facts. It's about experiencing history, about making that connection to the past on a deeper, more personal level.
Couldn't agree more. So as we wrap up our deep dive into the Cressy campaign, I want to leave you with this. We've explored the battles, the strategies, the political machinations, the economic factors, all of it. But for me, the most powerful takeaway is how Dan Jones challenges us to rethink our whole approach to history.
In what way?
By shifting the focus away from those great man narratives, the ones that center on kings and generals, and instead highlighting the experiences of everyday people. It's a powerful reminder that history isn't just about the big names and the big events. It's about the collective experience of humanity, all those individual stories that, when woven together, create this incredibly rich and complex tapestry. I think that's something worth remembering, isn't it?
It is. It reminds us that we're all part of something much bigger than ourselves, that our lives, our stories, they're all connected to the past in ways we might not even realize.
Exactly. So to all our listeners out there, I hope this deep dive has sparked your curiosity, maybe inspired you to delve a little deeper into this fascinating period of history. And remember, the past is never truly gone. It's always there, waiting to be rediscovered.
And if you're looking for a fantastic starting point, I highly recommend checking out Dan Jones's books Essex Dogs and Wolves of Winter. They're not just thrilling reads, they're portals into a world that's both familiar and utterly alien, brought to life by a master storyteller.
Absolutely. So until our next deep dive, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep those curiosity gears turning. You never know what amazing discoveries await you in the annals of history.